Something you mentioned there was retaliatory tariffs and, some points of talking about the tariffs that are imposed on American goods when they go out into the world. There's been so much talk about the tariffs that America is imposing on Mexico or Canada or China, as you said, or other countries in the world, but not as much about the actual tariffs that American companies or American agriculture are seeing when they're sending their products out into the world as well. This isn't just a one-way street where it's America imposing tariffs, correct? There's tariffs in China and there's tariffs in Mexico and there's tariffs for any of the goods that we're producing here and sending them out into the world and exporting. They're getting hit with tariffs, which is going to end up being the same kind of situation as what we're facing on the flip side, correct?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, the big story was European autos. So U.S. autos going to Europe are getting hit with a pretty heavy tariff. I think I will get the number wrong, but I think it was 20 or 25%. And so the Trump administration, just by floating that threat to say we're going to do retaliatory tariffs, so that any inbound European auto is also going to get hit with the same tariff. Then all of a sudden, those tariffs came off pretty quickly, and yeah, we'll see what that final looks like. But they reduced those tariffs significantly for U.S. outbound autos. So I think there's a strategy. It sounds like what they're going to roll out on April 2nd is a strategy to maybe use that across a wide variety of tariffs that other countries are applying to us. The one thing I didn't say right up front, Chris, is that you go all the way back into the 1800s. And in the 1800s, U.S. federal revenues, we got 90% of our U.S. federal revenues from tariffs. Today, we get about 2%. There are other countries, though, that are still sort of in that 1800s model where majority of their income is coming from imposing high tariffs on foreign countries, a lot of those being the United States, and a lot of it hitting the ag sector. And so I think a lot of this is really the Trump administration trying to ease that up. And I think that's what April 2nd will be all about.
To go into a little bit more detail about what you said there is that in I forgot the year, but we used to get 90% of our what was that again?
Federal income. So our
From
federal fund
from tariffs.
from tariffs.
And now we're down to 2%. So it
Right.
seems like, well, that doesn't how did we get that from tariffs into federal income? I'm curious about because I've heard this before, but I've never been able to draw the dot that says, okay, the manufacturer pays the import, as we talked about before, the import tax. So that tax is going to the treasury
Correct.
from, so it's going to be, so then what happens then the treasury has that and says, hey, we just made $25 off this $100 import here. That then goes into the federal budget is my guess
I think that's
about
it.
that.
It goes
Okay.
into the general fund. Right.
Okay. So we technically are making, the federal government is technically making money off of these import tariffs. Would that say 20% or 10%? And then what everybody's talking about is then the business or the company that imported can then turn around and say, we already paid that, let's say 10% for the import. We're passing that along. So your $100 product is now going to be $110 to make up for that.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. And so that's why a lot of people say ultimately it's like an extra tax on the US consumer because a company passes on that
Yeah.
tariff to the US consumer. We pay it when we go buy those products. But ultimately, that revenue that was generated at a federal level, is being paid by the US consumer ultimately, right? So that's
Hopefully
why.
going, yeah. Because
Right.
so hopefully what the thinking around this is the treasury collects the 10% that goes towards our federal budget that can then decrease taxes against an everyday American in a higher volume than what the extra $10 is going to be on that final product. Is that sort of the thinking behind that?
Yeah, that's it. That's it. And here's the difference too, is that there are a lot of people who believe in use taxes versus just mandatory taxes. So the federal income tax that you pay on your income is just mandatory, right? You don't have a choice in that. The use tax would be a product that comes in, has a 10% tariff applied to it, and the cost of that item goes up 10%. In most cases, I have a choice as to whether I want to go pay that extra 10% or not. It's
Okay.
a use tax. I choose whether I want to pay the tax or, no one's forcing me to go buy that item.
Yeah.
and and it works for some things, other things it doesn't. I mean, I have to eat, you know, I
Yeah.
I have to have energy to a degree. How much of that I do, I can calculate, and some would say I need to eat a lot less. So maybe that does apply to me. But yeah, but there is a difference there, but it's still a tax. Now, there's some estimates that the government, there's going to be retaliatory efforts. There's going to be some things that will moderate this amount. But the Trump administration is looking at $1.2 trillion over the course of about 5 years in additional income from the tariffs that are being applied. And maybe in their mind they have that bogey sitting out there, like that's our target. That's what we're going to go get for income. Now, again, there's a lot of things that offset that. It's, consumer spending could go down or income could go down. It could be offset by other impacts to federal taxation. Yeah. So federal income could go down, and we may not capture all of that 1.2 trillion, but that's what they're looking at.
We just mentioned a lot of factors that can go into that 1.2 trillion. But is the overall goal sort of with the tariffs? Because as you said, it was 90% before. Is the heavy use of these tariffs sort of to bring us closer to that model that was getting 90% of our income from there and sort of increase the 2% that we're at right now to maybe offset some of the budget deficit, some of the budget spending, some of the taxes that we get? As you said, that way we pay the tax when we purchase the product, not as much getting it taken out of our paycheck every week. Is that what they're sort of looking at, using this as heavily as they are, do you think? Or have they been used not just this administration, but in the past for those certain particular ways?
Yeah, I mean, it can be used to trim maybe federal income tax, but the days are gone when we can go back to just using tariffs to provide all of our income. Globalization is completely different today than it was in the 1800s.
Mhm.
So in the 1800s, you could apply the tariffs, and largely there were products we were buying that just weren't available anywhere else in the world. So you paid the tariff. That
Yep.
product, we always knew that one item has always cost $25, and you're paying a tariff on top of it, and that's just what it cost. Today with globalization, there's so many competitors that can provide that product or a similar product. The competition would make it almost impossible to say we're going to go generate, some, $23 trillion for the federal budget just off of tariffs.
Okay.
So remember, I'm talking about creating 1.2 trillion over 5 years. If you just take a nice simple calculation and you think about what we spend on an annual basis at a federal level, there's no way you could offset it. But you could help dent it, right? We could help dent it and maybe get some tax cuts,
Does
maybe
it
some
start?
relief.
Does something. It's better than nothing in there.
Right.
But there's no really no real way to go back. I mean, we're talking over 100 years at this point. And as you said, globalization is happening. Things have changed. So that 90% worked in that time, but you fast forward, the world's gotten a little bit smaller, easier to access. You can't sort of go back to that same thinking or usage of what was used in the past.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. Way too many different dynamics today. Um, we wouldn't starve to death, but we probably wouldn't have clothes to buy. And we probably couldn't afford them if we took that tack. So
So we're talking about tariffs and we're saying 25% here and 10% for this country. But you mentioned before with the automobiles, how, they're strictly saying, okay, 25% for any German automobiles that are coming in. So when they say tariffs against, say, Germany, it doesn't mean every single thing that's coming out of Germany is going to be hit with a 25% tariff, correct? It could be particular, markets or manufacturing or sectors or whatever you want to call it that get 25 while others could be seeing 10%, 5% or zero, correct?
absolutely, they can go into one SKU and they could say, that one a pin, like a ballpoint pen, for whatever reason, we need to apply 100% tariffs to that one item, and they could do that. And that one item coming out of Singapore, you know,
Mhm.
so they could do that. They would only do that in a case where the U.S. was literally going to lose an industry, maybe over some competitive issues.
Okay.
And typically you'll see that when there's some dumping, some accusations of dumping an
Mm.
item on the global market, where they're trying to account for that dumping by applying a significant tariff to slow down the import of that item. And that's a lot of one of the reasons why you see heavy steel tariffs is truly an effort to try and save the U.S. steel industry, and it's considered to be kind of a national security issue. If we don't have steel production, then in the event of a war, you're not making steel, and you're relying upon others to make those products for you. We learned in 2021 and 2022 that we had some of the major components that go into some of our most advanced missile systems in the United States that we procure 100% of today from an adversary. And it was up to 22 different products. And so, you wouldn't necessarily apply the tariffs right away, but there's urgency to get that supply chain shifted so that we control more of that. And then we learned with, baby formula, and we learned with the last hurricanes that went through Florida that we have all of our production of IV fluid concentrated in 2 buildings. It's the realization that the supply chain and sourcing risk exists that has caused some of this, and that's at some of the root of why we're applying tariff in such a broad way.
So it's not just, it seems like it's multifaceted. It's not just to get some incoming tax that can help out in the federal government, as we said, help cut the deficit or cut taxes or whatever, but it's also, to build up manufacturing within the United States, which then can build up employment and maybe bring down costs a little bit on certain items. But it's also about national security because, as you said, we have products that are being produced overseas that are vital to military components. And what happens if something goes sideways and now they're just like, well, we're going to cut you off and we don't have anything here. So it seems like the security aspect is that tariffs are putting a little bit of pressure upon these manufacturing companies to say, hey, we understand that this is the easy route. This is maybe the least expensive route, but we need you to be brought back onto the American shore at a national security risk, to make sure this is sealed up and we don't have to worry about this moving forward. So it seems like it's multifaceted between those three. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's I think so many people try to put like one rationale for tariff as an explanation as to why they're being done. And what makes it so confusing is that there's so many different rationales. But they all I was just laughing because Trump was being interviewed the other day, and he made the comment that tariff is like third or fourth on his list of most favorite words. It was like God, family, country, tariffs. And because he can use them for so many different things. He can use them to drive a country into making some geopolitical concessions. Maybe stop a war. There are things that it can be used for because you're applying so much economic pressure to that country that you can get so much out of it. So whether it's securing the supply chain for national security issues, whether it's trying to fix a geopolitical imbalance, whether it's trying to create tax revenue, whether it's just trying to fix a trade imbalance with the US, or whether it's to get fentanyl out of the country. I mean, they're using so many different rationale for why they're applying tariffs so aggressively. And, frankly, when you peel back the layers of the onion, they all can apply. I mean, they all have an impact and it all makes sense. It's just, I think the reason why it's such a hot topic right now is it's all coming at us so fast, and
Yeah.
it's so much so fast. It's hard to digest it all.
Because like we talked about, there's been tariffs since, 1800s. There's always been a tariff at some point or another. There's never been a time when the United States has sat here and been like, well, there's no tariffs. It's zero across the board. We've always had tariffs in some form or another with every administration throughout American history, correct? So this isn't like it's new, or it's just the way, like you said, the speed of how this is coming at us and the fluidity of the tariffs being used in the way they are.
Absolutely, and we look at a lot of commodities, and I monitor a lot of commodities for a lot of companies, and you can see, like, back in 1999, you can see, like, industrial production in some commodity classes. We were very high, and then over the last 20 years, it's just been like this sleigh ride to where the US production of those items has just fallen off a cliff, and that whole process of globalization and China going from just that country over there in the 1990s to becoming this global juggernaut has happened over the last 20 years. So starting with, at the end of the Clinton administration, you got the Bush administration that started to raise concerns over, how strong China was becoming and doing something about it, applying some tariffs here and there, the Obama administration continuing that, and the Trump administration hitting them hard, and then the Biden administration leaving all those tariffs in place and then adding more of its own. And now the Trump administration taking it to another level. It's just this evolution of trying to deal with these global juggernauts that have evolved and have gotten really good at manufacturing, production, automation. They're joining the modern world, and as they do, they're becoming formidable competitors. And we're all competing for finite resources, and so there's just this global tug of war that's becoming a bit of a trade war, and we're just seeing it being played out in front of our eyes.